Snow fell in a steady whisper over Coldwater that morning, blanketing the rooftops and factory lanes in a white so dense it silenced the world. The photograph had been taken just after noon, when the sun sat low but sharp, slicing pale light through the still air. Edwin Larke stood knee-deep in the snow, his breath clouding before him, hands trembling slightly as he steadied the brass legs of his tripod. He wasn't new to photography. He had documented weddings, storefronts, and the occasional school gathering. But something about this light felt wrong. It wasn't flat, as winter light should be. It shimmered, as if something unseen moved between the flakes. Before him stood the Snowman. 3 perfect tiers, compacted and round, the hat tilted with care, the scarf a bright scrap of wool borrowed from the school's lost and found. It was nothing remarkable. Children from the nearby lane had built it the evening before, laughing as they chased each other through the drifts. But now, in the still silence, Edwin saw what they had left behind, a figure too precise in proportion, too deliberate in posture. He raised his camera and squinted through the viewfinder, aligning the horizon. "Jonas," he called to his assistant, a young man of 19 with soot still on his collar from stoking the studio's furnace. "Hold steady." The lights perfect, Jonas stepped closer, his boots crunching against the crusted snow. "It doesn't look right," he muttered. "It's shadow. Look at it." Edwin frowned, lowering the lens cap and following his assistant's gaze. The snowman's shadow did not balloon outward in a soft mound as expected. Instead, it stretched across the frozen field, narrow, distinct, unmistakably human. He could make out the slant of shoulders, the crook of an elbow, even the faint suggestion of fingers extended as if reaching. Edwin adjusted his stance, thinking perhaps the sun had shifted, but the figure remained, defying the angle of light itself. "It must be the ridge behind," he said, half to himself. "An obstruction, maybe." He repositioned the tripod, moving 2 paces left. The shadow did not change. The outline stood independent, steady, and impossibly detailed. Jonas swallowed, his breath hitching. "Sir, maybe we shouldn't." "Quiet," Edwin snapped, masking his unease. He pressed the shutter. The plate clicked softly, freezing the scene in silence. A minute passed before he dared take another shot. "One more for clarity," he said, trying to sound composed. Jonas nodded stiffly, his eyes still locked on the snowman. The second exposure came and went, the sound almost too small against the vastness of the frozen plain. But when Edwin lowered the lens, the shadow was gone. The snowman stood clean and ordinary, the ground bare behind it. "You saw that, didn't you?" Edwin asked. Jonas's face was pale. "It moved," he whispered. "Inside. The snow. Something moved inside it." The words hung heavy in the air. Edwin said nothing. He dismantled the tripod with mechanical precision, his gloved fingers stiff from more than cold. As they trudged back toward the studio, he felt the weight of unease pressing between his ribs. He tried to reason with himself. The light, the lens, a trick of contrast. But when they reached the attic and developed the glass plate, the truth defied all logic. The emulsion hissed under the chemical bath, revealing a dark shape too deliberate to be chance. It was no trick of light, it was a form. A man's form, detailed and clear, his arms held slightly away from his sides as if mid-breath. Edwin leaned closer. The edges of the shadow seemed raised, blistered around the darkness like skin under heat. He touched the corner of the plate and flinched. It was warm. "Jonas," he murmured, "feel this." The young man hesitated, then reached out. "It's alive?" he said, half joking, half afraid. The room was quiet except for the drip of chemicals into the tray. Outside, the snow fell harder, muffling the sounds of the mill whistle. By dusk, the warmth had faded, leaving only the print, one that neither man could explain. Edwin stored it inside a tin box, locking it away with trembling hands. That night, as wind rattled the window panes, he dreamt of standing again before the snowman. But this time, the human shadow was not cast on the ground. It stood beside him, breathing, turning slowly toward the light. He woke to the smell of collodion still clinging to his skin and the faint impression of fingers pressed into the frost of the window. Weeks later, the photograph would surface again, sealed in an envelope marked, "Do not reproduce." Scholars would dismiss it, the papers would call it a chemical illusion, and yet those who looked too long into its dark shape would swear they saw movement. Something subtle, something watching. But on that cold February day, Edwin Larke knew only the sound of the shutter and the silence that followed. He did not yet know that his photograph would outlive him, that it would whisper through decades of dust and skepticism, waiting for someone else to see what he had seen. For now, it remained in the shadows, quiet, patient, and impossibly human. What you're about to hear is the file they never reopened. The fog rolled in without warning. At first it was only a thin veil over the riverbank, soft and white, drifting low among the frozen reeds. But within minutes it thickened into something that shimmered faintly, a luminous mist pulsing as though it had a heart of its own. Dr. Alaric Morn stood outside his small clinic on the corner of Harrow Street, notebook trembling in his gloved hands, his breath turning to silver smoke in the morning air. "That's no river gas," he murmured to himself, scribbling the date, February 3rd, 1909, and the temperature, which his mercury thermometer insisted was 9 below. The light from the fog glowed too evenly, too persistently. It was as if the snow itself had learned to breathe. From the end of the street, he heard the rhythmic crunch of boots. Elias Corr, the town's surveyor, emerged from the haze with his transit tripod over one shoulder, eyes wide behind fogged spectacles. "Doctor, you see it too?" he called, his voice breaking through the cold. "It's brighter near the schoolyard." Morn nodded, motioning for him to follow. Together, they walked past the frozen troughs and shuttered textile mill, where the great brick walls rose like tombs under the pale winter light. The fog pressed against their coats, strangely warm to the touch despite the air's sharpness. When they reached the schoolyard fence, the world fell silent. The mill whistle, the crows, even the river seemed to pause. There, in the middle of the yard, stood a snowman. 3 perfect spheres stacked neatly, the middle tier slightly tilted as if caught mid-turn. Its button eyes glinted like coal dust, and a torn scarf fluttered faintly in the still air. Yet it was not the snowman that froze them in place. It was the shadow stretching from its base across the ground, long, narrow, unmistakably human. It did not mimic the snowman's rounded form. It reached out like a man stepping forward, its arms tapering into fingers that dug black shapes into the snow. Corr lowered his tripod slowly. "The sun's wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's setting behind us." The doctor adjusted his glasses, his pulse hammering. He looked around. Every other shadow in sight stretched eastward, soft and pale. Only this one pointed west, dark and sharp as ink. "Maybe the mill lights," Morn muttered, though he knew there were none running that day. Or phosphorus from the waste pits. Reflection, perhaps. Yet even as he said it, the shadow's edge flickered, like something shifting beneath the surface. That night, Morn wrote his observation into the ledger under the heading Anomalous Frost Pattern. He described the temperature, the humidity, and what he called a sustained luminescence, lasting 10 minutes before vanishing. His handwriting quivered where he added, "Shadow inconsistent with object. Behavior independent of light angle." He closed the book, telling himself fatigue had made him exaggerate. Still, he left a candle burning in the window, uneasy in the silence that pressed against the town. 3 nights later, the parish pastor, Father Reynard Hale, stopped Morn after evening service. The older man's eyes were bloodshot, his breath carrying the faint scent of frost and incense. "Doctor," he whispered, "you saw the snowman too, didn't you?" Morn hesitated, then nodded. "Something's wrong by the river," Hale continued, gripping his sleeve. I went to bless the schoolyard after the children told stories of it moving. I saw footprints, only 2, not 3, human ones, leading nowhere. His voice broke on the last word. They met again the next morning, joined by Core and 2 mill watchmen. The fog returned, thick as cream, swallowing sound. Morn carried his lantern close, its flame guttering though no wind stirred. They reached the same spot, but the snowman was gone. Only a hollow depression remained where its base had stood. Still, there was the shadow. It lay across the snow like oil, unmoving even when the lantern light shifted. When Core stepped forward to touch it, the black surface rippled faintly, as though it were made of water under glass. He stumbled back, muttering, "It blinked. I swear, it blinked." By noon, word had spread. Some townsfolk said it was a trick of light. Others whispered about spirits of the drowned workers buried near the mill. Children avoided the schoolyard. Dogs refused to walk the path by the river. That same week, the police chief ordered a memorandum, an attempt to quiet rumors that might harm the mill's reputation. The report used the phrase chemical afterimages to explain the phenomenon, blaming industrial residue and the poor winter air. It was a tidy explanation, official and comforting. But Morn saw the attached witness list before it was sealed. None were mill workers. There was Father Hale, Elias Core, and a constable named Bram Keene, all reputable men with no interest in spectacle. Each statement described the same vision, a snowman's shadow detaching itself at dusk and walking toward the river before fading in the mist. Hale's note contained one more line, hastily scrawled, "It looked back." The following days passed in tense quiet. The fog stopped appearing, though the temperature held steady below freezing. The townsfolk returned to their routines, pretending not to glance at the schoolyard as they passed. But Morn couldn't rest. He revisited the spot under moonlight, finding faint impressions in the snow, human-shaped, spaced evenly apart, leading toward the riverbank where the ice had recently cracked. He crouched, running his fingers over the marks, the cold biting through his gloves. "Not a trick of light," he whispered. "Not anymore." When he returned home, he opened his ledger again. On a new page he wrote the date, underlined it twice, then added, "Luminous fog, persistent. Witness accounts consistent. Source unknown." His hand hovered over the paper before adding a final line, "Possible phenomenon of reflection or memory in frozen vapor." He didn't know what that meant, only that it felt truer than anything else he could write. The official police report was sealed the next day under order of the district clerk. Stamped across the final page in bold type were the words, "No further inquiry advised." That phrase appears again, 30 years later, in a government catalog card. The first anomaly was logged on February 5, 1909, at precisely 4:32 p.m. The air above Coldwater was brittle with cold, and the late sun hung like a dull coin above the rooftops. Edwin Larke steadied his wooden tripod on the crusted snow behind the parish schoolyard. The river beyond the fence shimmered faintly, its surface frozen solid, broken only by slow-moving plumes of vapor that curled upward like breath. Beside him, his assistant, Jonas Marin, rubbed his gloved hands together, muttering that the temperature would crack the lens before the plate could even set. But Larke wasn't listening. His attention was fixed on the snowman he had built 2 hours earlier, a simple figure meant only to test light scatter on white surfaces. It should have been nothing more than a study in contrast. Yet something about the way its shadow stretched across the yard made him raise the camera again. He adjusted the brass focus ring, squinting through the viewfinder. "The light's all wrong," he murmured. Jonas leaned in. The snowman's shadow didn't match its round shape. It was long, narrow, and unmistakably human. Shoulders, arms, even the faint suggestion of fingers at the edge of the snowbank. Jonas frowned. "There's someone behind it," he said, but when they turned, the yard was empty, only the sound of the wind moving through the birch trees. "No footprints," Larke whispered, stepping closer. He snapped the shutter once, a clean metallic click echoing through the cold air. Then again, immediately after. The second time, the figure was gone. Back in the attic darkroom, the scent of ether and collodion filled the cramped space. Light from a kerosene lamp trembled across the rafters. Larke worked quickly, lowering the glass plate into the silver nitrate bath. Jonas watched in silence, his reflection ghosting across the dark pan. When the image began to appear, faint and milky, Larke's heart quickened. The snowman emerged, its form solid and harmless, but behind it, the dark stretch of shadow took on startling definition. It looked like a man standing several paces away, head tilted slightly forward, as though observing the photographer. Jonas took an involuntary step back. "That wasn't there," he said. Larke studied the print, every instinct pushing him to rationalize the image. Maybe a reflection from the window pane. Maybe an error in exposure time. Yet he'd seen the sun's angle, measured it, and noted it in his ledger, 20 degrees above the horizon, with clear sky and no obstructions. "It shouldn't be this long," he muttered. The lamplight wavered, and for a moment the dark outline seemed to shift. Jonas flinched, nearly knocking over the tray. "It moved," he whispered. Larke dismissed it, though unease crept into his stomach like a slow chill. "You're imagining things," he said, forcing calm into his voice, but his eyes didn't leave the print. Hours passed. The cold from outside bled through the attic boards. As dawn crept in, the emulsion began to blister in strange concentric patterns. The edges near the dark figure swelled into faint ridges that resembled fingerprints pressed into the film from within. Larke brushed his thumb across them. They were slightly warm. He drew back, unsettled. Jonas wouldn't come near the tray again. "It's wrong light," Jonas said finally. "It's not reflecting, it's remembering." Larke snapped at him to stop talking nonsense, but the words stayed with him long after Jonas left. That evening, the photograph was delivered to the Coldwater Chronicle. The editor, Mr. Wren Hale, peered at it for less than a minute before sliding it back across the desk. "Unsettling," he said flatly. "The townsfolk won't want this printed." Larke tried to argue that it was only a trick of contrast, but Hale shook his head. "There's a man in your picture, Mr. Larke. Whether he was there or not doesn't matter. It looks alive." In the following days, Larke worked alone, making duplicate exposures and burning through half his stock of glass plates. None reproduced the effect. The snowman's shadow behaved normally every time. He began to suspect that the first plate had captured something fleeting, something between moments. The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Nights later, as he developed another set of negatives, the lamp guttered out, plunging the attic into darkness. From somewhere near the trays came the faint crackle of heat against glass, like ice fracturing. When he struck a match, he saw one of the earlier prints curling at the corners, the dark region deepening to black. Jonas stopped returning after that. He told the town barber that the picture had looked back at him. Within a week, Larke's neighbors smelled smoke rising from the direction of his home. By the time the fire wagon arrived, the studio was a charred skeleton of beams and glass. Investigators found no cause, no spilled oil, no shorted lamp wire. Only the heavy scent of chemicals and the faint scorch of something metallic in the air. When the ashes cooled, they uncovered a small tin box fused shut from heat. Inside lay one object wrapped in blackened paper, the original negative of the snowman. The emulsion, though warped, remained intact. The human-shaped shadow still burned into its surface as if refusing to fade. Only the negative survived, locked inside a melted tin box. The smell of burned flesh reached Dr. Alaric Morn before the patient's stretcher did. It was February 12th, 1911, and the corridor of the small wooden clinic shuddered beneath the winter wind that seeped through every crack in the walls. The attendants pushed through the doorway carrying a man whose hands were bandaged in rough cloth darkened with blisters and soot. His name, they said, was Jonas Marin, the same assistant who had once helped Edwin Larke photograph the Coldwater Snowman. He was half-conscious, muttering the same two words again and again. It blinked. It blinked. Dr. Morn bent close. The man's eyes darted behind swollen lids, unfocused as if he were watching something invisible just above him. "Jonas, what blinked?" he asked softly, but the patient only shuddered, his lips cracking from the heat of his own fever. The doctor turned to the attendants. "Get cold water and morphine. Keep the lamps low." He hesitated before adding, "No mirrors in the room." He did not know why he said it, only that something about the man's terror felt contagious, as if seeing what he had seen might spread through reflection. For 3 nights, Jonas Marin lingered between waking and delirium. Whenever the lantern light flickered, he would pull his hands beneath the blanket and whisper that the shadow was still watching from the plate. On the 4th morning, he fell silent, and the only sound in the ward was the faint hiss of frost creeping against the window pane. Dr. Morn noted his condition as severe burns, delusional repetition, likely hallucination. But at the bottom of the chart he scribbled something uncharacteristic. Possible exposure to active photograph. Years passed before anyone outside Coldwater mentioned the incident again. Then, in the spring of 1913, Professor Alden Weyer arrived from Hadrill College carrying a battered leather satchel and a request to examine the surviving glass negative. He was a precise man, thin, spectacled, with fingers stained from silver nitrate, and his curiosity was almost clinical. "If this plate truly carries residual heat," he told the curator, "then it's no photograph at all. It's an emitter." They unwrapped the melted tin box that had once housed the plate. The glass inside was warped along one edge but otherwise intact. When Weyer set it beneath the mercury vapor lamp, the laboratory filled with a low hum. Light trembled across the plate's surface, glinting off minute scratches like veins of ice. "Strange," Weyer murmured, adjusting the rheostat. "Density reading, 0.67. Impossible for a winter capture without direct sunlight." He leaned closer, his breath fogging the edge of the frame. "The source of the shadow exceeded ambient brightness," he concluded aloud, "not absence thereof." His assistant shifted uneasily. "Meaning?" Weyer straightened, his voice flat. "Meaning the shadow gave off more light than it absorbed." 2 years later, in a different wing of the same college, Dr. Felix Knorr conducted his own experiment. Knorr was younger, more daring, a man who believed that every mystery could be split open by spectrum analysis. He used an argon lamp, its pale blue beam slicing the darkness like a blade. When the light struck the plate, the figure's outline glowed faintly red before draining back to gray. "Red absorption exceeds blue," he noted, eyes wide. "It behaves as though warmth gathers in the darker bands." His assistant tilted the lamp lower, adjusting the angle beneath 40 degrees. Instantly, the effect reversed. The red drained away, replaced by a brittle, colorless shimmer that crawled toward the top of the frame. The room grew colder. Knorr wiped his palms on his coat. "Document this and switch it off," he said quickly. When they powered down the lamp, a faint afterglow lingered in the air, like the echo of a lantern behind closed eyes. In March 1939, decades later, the plate resurfaced at the Provincial Museum for cataloging. A technician named Bernard Hale handled it alone in the archive basement. The electric heater sputtered behind him, failing to warm the concrete floor. When he touched the shadowed region of the photograph, he drew back with a start. The glass was warm. He pressed his hand near it again, certain he was mistaken, but the warmth remained, pulsing gently beneath his fingertips. Bernard wrote a note on the catalog sheet. "Heat where there is none." Moments later, the overhead bulbs dimmed, one by one, until only the desk lamp glowed. The warmth faded. Bernard slipped the plate into its envelope and sealed it shut, his pulse loud in his ears. Upstairs, the curator was already on the telephone, arguing with a funding official who had grown weary of ghost science. Within the week, the museum's experimental grants were rescinded. The Coldwater plate, deemed a curiosity rather than evidence, was returned to storage in a plain cardboard sleeve. When the archivist opened the envelope years afterward, he found more than the infamous photograph inside. Tucked behind the original glass lay a second print, unmarked and undeveloped, its emulsion faintly clouded. Under the microscope it showed the same riverbank, the same stretch of winter field, yet no snowman stood in the frame. Only the long, empty shadow remained, stretching forward across untouched snow as if waiting for a body to return. Inside the envelope was a second photograph, taken years later, same snow, no snowman. Snow fell in thick, muted flakes the evening the Coldwater Optic Club gathered in Edwin Larke's rebuilt studio. The air smelled of soot and varnish. The rafters still carried the black stains from the fire 3 years earlier. Around a long oak table, 5 men in wool coats leaned over a collection of cracked glass plates laid carefully on a velvet cloth. A single kerosene lamp swung faintly above them, its flame bending with every draft. Dr. Morn, now older and frail, adjusted his spectacles and squinted at the image that had haunted their town for decades, the snowman whose shadow stretched wrong. "It's a trick of exposure," declared Professor Alden Vire, his voice sharp with certainty. "Uneven silver nitrate." Larke must have used a compromised plate. Larke said nothing. His eyes followed the glinting edge of the negative, tracing the silhouette that had burned through his dreams since that winter of 1909. "Then why does the control plate show a normal shadow?" he asked softly. "Same lens, same day, same distance. Only this one," he tapped the plate with a gloved finger, "moves when you turn it." The men shifted uncomfortably. The glass did seem to shimmer under the lamplight, its dark center reflecting not the ceiling, but something deeper, like the faint outline of a man caught mid-breath. Vire's jaw tightened. "You're seeing what you want to see," he muttered, scribbling notes. "Human eyes fill gaps where there are none." "Perhaps," said Larke, his tone heavy with exhaustion, "but it filled the same gap for every man who saw it." They tested the theory late into the night. Fresh plates were prepared, silver nitrate poured, exposures measured to the second. Outside, the storm pressed against the shutters like a living thing. When the first test image emerged from the developing tray, the men leaned in together. The room went silent. The snow figure in the new photograph was clear and ordinary, but at its feet, faintly, a stretch of darkness crawled outward like smoke. It wasn't shaped like a man this time, more like the ghost of one struggling to stand. Vire slammed the tray shut. "Refraction," he insisted. "Light off the frost crystals." "That's all." But Larke's assistant, Marin's younger brother Thomas, whispered, "The frost doesn't move." His hands trembled as he wiped the fluid from the print. "It's changing." The men argued for hours, voices rising, each clinging to science, superstition, or fear. When dawn finally broke, they gathered their results. Nothing conclusive, only a deep unease. The club's official statement, written in tidy script, read, "Uneven silver nitrate exposure resulting in spectral elongation of reflected light." It was neat, explainable, harmless, and utterly false. Weeks later, the Coldwater shadow became the talk of every tavern in town. Children dared each other to build snowmen by the riverbank, watching their shadows for signs of movement. Factory workers spoke of an old legend, of a mill hand named Abram Vale, who had frozen solid in the blizzard of 1888 after falling asleep beside the sluice gate. "They never found him," said one laborer to another, eyes darting to the frost-streaked windows. "They said he just stood there till the thaw took him." Larke, now weary and sickly, searched the burial records himself. No Abram Vale, no missing worker, only blank entries where the dates should have been. In his private journal, he wrote, "The town remembers what the books do not." That winter, another photograph surfaced. A young postmaster named Roderick Hensel had taken a plate of the same riverbank during the festival. When developed, the image showed the snowman still standing, though none had been built that year. Its form was half-melted, hollow-eyed, the same faint outline stretching behind it. The local paper refused to print it. "Too unsettling," said the editor again, echoing his predecessor. "No sense frightening the townsfolk with ghosts made of silver." By 1950, the incident had acquired the dignity of folklore. Men laughed about it over brandy, calling it Coldwater's own phantom frost. But Larke, now gray and hunched, lived with the truth no theory could quiet. Sometimes, when the snow fell just right, he claimed he could see the shadow moving across the far field, slow, deliberate, as though waiting for him to look back. When a state archivist reopened the file in 1954 for re-evaluation, he found 3 sealed reports stacked together. The first was stamped analyzed in fading ink. The second, re-examined in darker type. The last bore only a single word, anomalous. Beneath it, a margin note in the archivist's own hand read, "Observation inconclusive. Image persists under low light. No further inquiry advised." The town moved on. The mills closed. The river froze slower each year. And yet, on the museum's night watch log, an entry appeared without signature. Shadow still visible at 2043 under lamplight reflection. And, though no one spoke of it again, every man who ever studied that photograph, scientist, skeptic, or believer, swore that if you looked at it long enough it seemed to shift ever so slightly, like something breathing beneath glass. And yet the shadow still looks back when the light shifts. Harold Eames pressed the switch that powered the digitizer, and the soft hum of the machine filled the empty archive room. It was January 17th, 1978, another long night in the Vermont Historical Bureau. Snow whispered against the frosted windows, the sound faint but constant, like distant static. The building was empty except for him, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and fingers still trembling from too much coffee. Before him lay a small envelope marked in fading ink, Coldwater Parish Archive, frame 22. He'd handled hundreds of such artifacts before, war letters, county maps, ledger fragments, but never one that made the air feel this heavy. He slid the glass negative onto the light bed and lowered the scanner arm. The pale blue glow washed across the room, catching dust in the air like falling snow. On the screen, the image appeared. A snowman standing in the foreground, hat tilted, scarf stiff from frost. Behind it stretched a shadow, too long, too human. Harold leaned closer, blinking twice to clear his eyes. The shadow's shape was almost upright, its arms uneven, as though one elbow bent mid-motion. "Just exposure distortion," he muttered, though his voice cracked slightly. He adjusted the resolution, watching pixels sharpen until the edges of the shadow looked textured, like skin under shallow water. When he toggled the infrared filter, the monitor pulsed faintly red. It was subtle at first, a rhythmic flicker in the corner of the frame. He frowned and checked the settings. The emulsion data showed no dyes, no infrared spectrum at all. Yet the pulse persisted, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat buried beneath the snow. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. "That's not possible," he whispered. The hum of the digitizer deepened, as if the machine itself were straining. He reached for his notebook and scribbled, "Frame 22, anomalous IR activity. Possible interference from heat sensor." The lights in the archive dimmed, then steadied again. The air had turned colder, not gradually but sharply, like someone had opened a freezer door beside him. Harold rubbed his forearms, his fingers brushing against gooseflesh. On the screen, the shadow's edge seemed to breathe, the outline swelling and shrinking in rhythm with his own pulse. He backed away from the table. The hum changed pitch, a low tremor that vibrated through the floorboards. "Come on, don't freeze on me now," he muttered, pressing the power button. The machine didn't stop. Instead, the frame flickered once, twice, and then stabilized. The snowman remained still, but the shadow had shifted. Its arm, no longer angled downward, now reached slightly outward, its hand spread open toward the glass. Harold's mouth went dry. He blinked, leaned in, and saw the faintest distortion ripple along the fingers of that dark outline, like motion caught between frames. A soft knocking echoed through the corridor outside. He froze, staring at the closed door. 3 knocks, then silence. "Museum, staff," he called, but his voice sounded swallowed by the room. The air felt thin, brittle. When he looked back at the monitor, the shadow's hand had moved again, closer this time, its fingertips grazing the snowman's rounded side. His throat tightened. "It's residual exposure," he said under his breath. "Some sort of double image." He reached for the keyboard to pause the scan, but the display flared. A wash of light flooded the frame, revealing faint horizontal lines running through the shadow's torso, almost like ribs. Then the pulse quickened. The red glow brightened and dimmed, faster each time. He grabbed his notes, flipping to the previous page. If pulse rate increases, possible signal interference from heater coils. But the heater was off. The room had no vents at all. Harold looked up at the physical photograph still resting beneath the scanner's glass plate. It wasn't glowing, but the air above it shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt. He felt his heartbeat hammering in his temples. His instincts told him to stop, to pull the plug, but curiosity, the same stubborn force that had guided his 30 years in archives, held him frozen in place. He adjusted the brightness one last time. The screen darkened, and within that darkness, the outline moved. The torso twisted slightly, as if the figure were turning toward the lens. The flicker of red sharpened into the shape of a head, and for one impossible instant, the shadow seemed to inhale. A thin line of static whispered through the speakers, a sigh, or the sound of wind trapped in old film. Harold stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. "No," he said aloud, shaking his head. "It's just an illusion." But even as he said it, he could hear the faint rhythmic sound continuing from the machine, steady, alive. He reached for the power cable, intending to yank it free. Just before he did, the monitor brightened once more, and a sentence appeared across the bottom of the screen, unprompted, not a part of any known system interface. The outline opened. The lights in the archive went out. For a moment, there was only the red glow from the digitizer, faint and pulsing like the last ember of a dying fire. Harold's breathing grew shallow. The cold was unbearable now, biting through his clothes. He whispered to himself, "It's just residual light." But the glow began to spread, spilling across the walls like a widening shadow. Then, with a soft click, everything stopped. The hum, the pulse, the light. Silence fell. When the morning staff arrived, they found Harold slumped beside the table, his hand still clutching a pencil. The screen displayed the final frame, unchanged except for one new detail. The snowman stood alone, but where its shadow had been, a faint hand now overlapped the snow, palm upturned as though pressing outward from beneath the image. The archivist's notebook lay open, the last line half-written. The outline opened. Today. The print rests behind glass at the Marrow Hollow Museum, temperature controlled to -3 degrees. Visitors claim their reflections dim when they lean too close. You can still see the shape's faint hand overlapping the snow. Is it a trick of exposure, or something that remembered light before life? If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. created solely for entertainment. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It delves into themes of mystery, perception, and the thin line between reality and illusion. Its purpose is to intrigue, provoke curiosity, and remind us how easily the ordinary can turn extraordinary when seen through a different light.